All right, so this might be all the people we're going to get. I counter-programmed the town meeting, and that was probably foolish of me, but it's too late now. Okay, so this is part 22 of our series on the 8th chapter of Bava Kama. We are going to spend the entire evening on page 91a. We're only about 2 pages from the end of the chapter, but they are extremely long pages, and it will be challenging to try to finish before the end of the school year. Honestly, I'm not sure we're going to. We will have to see what happens. But we'll do our part tonight. Okay. We begin with a question. So they had a question. Is there assessment about damages? Or is there not assessment in damages? And I'm sorry, they should both say either as damages or assault. It's the same word both times. It really doesn't matter which word I used, but I shouldn't have switched, and I apologize for that. We are talking about damaging a person's body. And the assessment that we're talking about is connected to the assessment that we spoke about in last week's class, where we talked about this Tana named Shimon Hatimni, who thinks that the Torah specifically mentions a fist in the description of an almost murder or a sort of murder or a questionable murder, in which somebody grievously injures another person, and then you have to wait and see whether the victim dies or not before you know whether to try the assailant for murder or for assault. And in that case, it's specified that he hits him with a fist or with a rock. And so Rabbi Shimon Hatimni had said that the reason why it mentions a fist there is that a fist is something which is possible for the witnesses and the court to examine during the trial and have their own opinion about whether or not it's believable that somebody would be killed or damaged by being hit by this fist. And also possibly, since in order to be convicted, certainly of murder and possibly also of assault, that may be part of what we're talking about this evening, but for sure, in order to be convicted of murder, you would need to have been able to predict in advance that what you were doing was going to kill the person, such that you could be doing it on purpose, right? If I do something and I have no way of knowing that it's potentially lethal and it kills somebody, so we could talk about my doing it on purpose, we could talk about my being very irresponsible, but you can't really say that I murdered someone on purpose, because the thing I thought I was trying to do wasn't something that kills people. So you don't really have intent for the action that actually killed him. So Rabbi Shimon Hatimni thinks that you need the judges and the witnesses to be able to look at the fist and say, well, yeah, that guy should have known that he could kill somebody with that fist. Or no, I don't think so. Okay, so our question here is a parallel question about damaging a person's body, or possibly damaging property, but damage of one kind or another. And the question is, does the court, or possibly do the witnesses, but more likely does the court, need to have access to the thing that actually did the damage so that they can assess whether it seems plausible that it would be expected to do that kind of damage? Okay, so back in the Gemara, mi amrinan liktalahu de amdinan bahachi nafkan neshama bahachi lo nafkan neshama. Do we say that it's just with reference to murder, where we do this kind of appraisal and we say, well, yeah, with this kind of thing people die, and with that kind of thing people don't die? Aval l'nezikin kol dehu, but for damages, any amount of damage will do it. It doesn't really matter whether the weapon and the damage it caused match each other. O dilma loshna, or maybe there's really no difference. Tashma. So we're going to teach a series of 3 braitot Each one we're going to try to prove that it demonstrates either that we do assessment for damages or that we don't. And in the end, we're going to come back around to Shimon HaTimni. But here's our first break. So, ma bor sheyesh bo kedei lahamit asarat tfachim. So just as a pit which is deep enough to kill, and here we're talking about killing animals, not people, but deep enough to kill is 10 handbreadths deep. A handbreadth is in the vicinity of 3.5 inches, give or take. So we're talking about something that's about 3 feet deep, where it's not like a hugely deep pit. But that is enough to kill an animal that falls into it, we think. Obviously, if it were deeper, it would definitely be deep enough. So likewise, any hole in the ground that's deep enough to kill has to be at least 10 handbreadths. So it's true not just of a pit, but also presumably of a trench or a well or whatever other kind of hole in the ground you might be digging. If you dug something that was less than 10 handbreadths deep, and then an animal fell in, and the animal died, you're exempt, right? It's not your responsibility that it died when it fell into a pit that was too shallow to be reasonably expected to cause death. On the other hand, huzakbo, if the animal was just injured rather than killed, then chayav, the person who left the pit in its uncovered condition, which caused the animal to fall in, that person is going to be responsible for the damages to the animal. So we're going to hypothesize, my love mimata lamala kachashiv. So isn't it the case that we are measuring from below to above, by which we mean that anything less than this number is good enough? Why the idiom for that is from below to above, I don't know, but I wasn't sure what the right idiom in English was, so I just left it. And then in that case, this is what it says. Mitefach ve'ad asara, from one tefach, from one handbreadth up to 10. And I'm not sure you even need one for this hypothetical. We're going to reject it anyway, so it doesn't matter that much, but it might even be that a fractional handbreadth would be good enough. Mita leka nazikin ika, but that can't cause death, but it can cause damage. Alma linazikin koldahu, and therefore for damages, any amount is enough. So this from below to above kind of measurement, what that means is that anything below the threshold is good enough. We don't need it to be any particular amount within that. In that case, shma mina ein omdin l'nazik. And in that case, the rule would be that we don't need to assess for damages, because if that's how it works, then all you need is testimony that there was a pit there. Doesn't make any difference how deep the pit was, because any size pit is big enough to cause damages. The animal fell in the pit, the animal is damaged, QED. Right? That's all we would need. But we reject that. Lo. No, in fact, we are measuring from above to below, which is an idiom which we will define as follows. And again, I don't know if there is an equivalent idiom in English. I don't know what it is. In that case, it would mean asara mitaik, with if your pit is 10 handbreadths deep, then they can cause the animal to die. Pachot me'asara purta, if it's a little bit less than 10, then nazikin ita mita leka, then it can cause damage, but it doesn't cause death. But it has to be almost 10 handbreadths. Right? When we say we're measuring from above to below, what that idiom means is that the number that we're giving is the boundary between death and damages, but you can't go very far below the boundary even for damages. And in that case, In that case, in fact, we are going to need to measure the pit in order to know whether you're responsible for damages. We're going to need to do assessment for damages. Because if we say that it's not, the pit isn't supposed to be able to injure your donkey unless it's almost 10 handbreadths deep, then now we got to send somebody down with a measuring stick to find out whether it's 8 handbreadths or 9 handbreadths or 9.5 handbreadths. And in fact, we're going to have to figure out what we mean by almost 10 handbreadths, because that's not a very specific number. But whatever it is, it's something that's a requirement. It's not just whatever. Okay. And anything that we're going to hold responsible for damage needs to be something which you can be injured by. Meaning, I think that the court is going to look in detail at what the damage was and at what supposedly caused the damage. And if the two don't match up, then you won't be held responsible. Because in this version, you're only going to be held responsible if it was predictable that the thing that caused the damage was going to cause it. Okay, so we have not demonstrated anything here because we could, in fact, read this Breita either way. Either we could read it as, well, anything under 10 handbreadths causes damage and you don't need to measure it as long as the hole exists and the animal got damaged. That's all we need to know. Or you could read it as that there is, in fact, a specific depth that you need, but it's below 10 handbreadths, in which case we're going to have to send somebody to measure it and we're going to need to assess it. Okay, so no results. We have not proved one way or the other. Next try, Tashma. Hikau al eino v'simo. So somebody hit somebody on the eye and blinded him, and we're going to find out in a second that this is a master beating a slave, with all the usual discomfort that causes. But it matters because slaves only go free if the master blinds their eye or deafens them or does certain other very specific injuries. So the master hit the slave on the eye and blinded him. Al ozno v'chirsho, or he hit him on his ear and made him deaf. Eved yotzei bahen l'chibut. With either of those things, the slave gets emancipated. That sounds like you're supposed to do something. The slave automatically becomes free if either of those things happen. On the other hand, keneged eino ve'eino ro'eh. If the master hit the slave next to his eye, and the slave is no longer able to see, or he doesn't see, or keneged ozno ve'eino shomea, or next to his ear, and now he doesn't hear, ein eved yotzei bahen l'chibut. The slave does not go free because of those injuries. Now, a lot is going to hang on why. My tama. Lav mishum deba'inan umdana. Isn't it because we require an assessment, ushma mina yesh umdana lenazikin, in which case that would demonstrate that in fact you do need assessment for damages. And I think what that means is that if we would say we need assessment here, that would mean that we would bring in experts, doctors maybe, who would, appraise whether it's plausible that hitting somebody in a particular way would cause blindness or cause deafness. And we are sort of using as a shorthand for that, that if you hit them on the eye, that's plausible that it would blind them. And if you don't hit them on the eye, but you hit them someplace nearby, then we could believe that occasionally it could cause blindness, but it's not likely that the owner would anticipate that, so he can't be held responsible for it. And that would bring us back again to whatever it is that happened, you would assess whether it was plausible that it would have that result, which is, again, back to our idea of assessment. But we're going to reject that. Lo, mishum de amrinan hu de ibit nafshe. Nope, because it's not that we think that these injuries where the slave got hit next to the eye or next to the ear, it's not that we think that those are cases where the slave has actually been blinded, but it was so unlikely to happen that you can't hold the owner responsible, right? In which case, the reason for not holding the owner responsible would be that we do, in fact, examine the case to see whether it was plausible. That's not what was happening here. Instead, what's happening here is that we think, in fact, that it's so impossible to blind somebody by hitting them near their eye or deafen somebody by hitting them near their ear that we don't actually believe that that's what happened here. And we think that the slave is so frightened by having been hit in a place that seems dangerously close to blinding or deafening him, that he is experiencing a psychosomatic reaction in which he can't hear or can't see. We don't question his experience. We're not saying that he's faking, but we think that it's A, not caused by the injury, and possibly also B, not permanent. Either one of those, I think, actually would be enough to prevent him from going free. But I think we probably believe both of those things here. And neither of those has anything to do with assessment, because those are not about assessing whether the weapon or the assault was serious enough to cause the damage. Those are about assessing whether the damage exists. And everybody understands that you're going to have to assess whether the person was damaged in order to determine whether the person is, what the person is responsible for, what the assailant is responsible for. So if what this does is it says, well, you actually can't tell here whether the assessment that we're doing is an assessment of the weapon and the assault, in which case it would prove our case, or whether it's an assessment of the injury and the victim to see how badly hurt they are. And in that case, that wouldn't tell us anything interesting at all, because we knew that already. Okay, so now we go off on a little bit of a tangent with reference to this psychosomatic damage. So, Kedetanya, hamav'id et chavero patur midinei adam v'chayav b'dinei shamayim. So the Braita teaches that somebody who frightens his friend is exempt from the laws of people and obligated in the laws of heaven. Now, this is a distinction we make sometimes when we feel that the fair thing to do would be for somebody to have to pay. But strictly speaking, the law doesn't require them to. So you divide it and you say, well, people can't do anything to hurt you, but God is going to hold you responsible. Okay, so, and if you frighten somebody, and presumably this means on purpose, you frighten them and you succeed in frightening them, that is not a damage that you can force payment for in a human court. Although saying that you deserve to be judged in a divine court is certainly not a statement that you didn't do anything wrong. So Ketzad, how does that work? How do you frighten somebody into damage? And it's going to turn out that we don't really mean frighten. What we mean is some kind of action at a distance in which you don't touch their physical body, but you succeed in causing them damage anyway. So taka be'ozno v'chirsho patur. The word taka seems to have a bit of a dispute about what it means. We've seen this phrase before, and I'm translating it differently here because the translation we used last time following Rashi there is not going to work here, because it would not be an example of what we need an example of here. The last time we saw it, Rashi said that it meant that somebody hit his friend in the ear. like with a fist. That is definitely not what it means here, because here we're talking about without touching the person, as will become very clear in a second. But what kind of damage you can do to somebody's ear without touching them, it certainly involves some kind of loud noise, but taf kuf ayin is a root that has a collection of meanings, including to poke, which is where presumably Rashi and his teacher got the meaning to punch from the last time we saw this, but also including either to shout or to blow a shofar. Both of those meanings go all the way back to Tanakh. And presumably that is why Jastrow here thinks it means he blew a shofar in his ear, and Steinsaltz thinks it means he shouted. It may very well be that it doesn't matter, that either one of those would do. Okay, so somebody made a loud noise in somebody else's ear and deafened him. That sounds like it's an actual physical result of a physical action. It doesn't actually sound like frightening, but it is an action at a distance without actually touching the person. Yes, Mindy, did you want to say something?
Yes. How could Rashi's explanation be plausible? Given
so that's not what he says here. That's what he said the last time we had a case of somebody who was taka be'ozno, and in that case, it there seemed to be physical damage to the outside of the ear. It was very reasonable that it was a punch.
Okay.
But the fact that the Mishnah and the Breitot are using the same phrase to mean contradictory things is a little bit problematic. And you would think that if an editor would have cleaned that up, but apparently not.
Yeah. Okay.
But in this case, it's definitely without touching him, because the alternative case is achazo v'taka be'ozno v'chirsho chayav. If he grabbed him, and it doesn't sound like he's grabbing his ear, it sounds like he's just grabbing some part of the person to hold him still, and then made this sound in his ear, and that deafened him, then now he's responsible to pay for the deafness. So it doesn't take very much of a physical assault to make you responsible also for the things that you did from a distance, shall we say, with sound or with emotion or whatever. But it seems like the Breita is not comfortable with the idea that you could be responsible for causing a physical injury if you don't commit a physical assault against the person of the victim. And so if you deafen somebody just by making noise, it sounds like that's not that's not an assault that we can make you pay for in a human court. But if you grab somebody and yell in their ear while you're grabbing them, then you're now responsible for everything, including deafening them, even though you did that using just noise. Okay. And that is supposed to be parallel to the case with the slave, where you hit them near but not on their ear, where the causality between the assault and the deafness is not tight enough for you to be responsible, and possibly also we think that the deafness is not as deafening as it would be if you'd actually hit their ear. But at the very least, we think that it's not clear that it was directly caused by the punch. Okay, so that Breita did not, right, this is our second Breita. It did not succeed in demonstrating that we need to assess a weapon or an assault in order to find out whether it should have been able to cause this damage, because we ended up deciding that probably what we are assessing when we talk about the difference between hitting the ear and hitting next to the ear, probably what we're assessing is the damage to the person, and whether the damage is serious enough, not the assault, and whether the assault was the kind of assault that should have caused that kind of damage. So that didn't get us what we were looking for. So we're going to try again. Tashma. Chamisha dvarim omdim oto v'notnin lo miyad. So this Breita says the 5 things, and these are the 5 things that we started at the beginning of the chapter with, the 5 things that we assess in the case of assault, which are nezek, which is the sort of absolute loss of value of the person's body as assessed by their loss of value on the slave market, tsar, pain, which we ended up deciding we're assessing by how much a hypothetical similar person would pay to experience the same assault but without pain. Ripui, which was medical expenses, shevet, which is lost time at the job you will now be able to return to in your damaged state after you heal, and boshet, which is humiliation or emotional damage, something like that. Okay, so all 5 of those items are assessed and paid immediately at the time of the lawsuit, which presumably could be, if necessary, immediately after the assault. Certainly, you could still be at the very beginning of your recovery process at the point when we're doing this assessment. And at that moment, the way we do the assessment is by assessing what we expect the medical bills to be and what how long we expect the person to be out of work at the time when we do the assessment. But we project outward all the way to what we anticipate will be the end of the healing process. If they assessed him and then he became weaker, he continued to become weaker, then we still only give him what we had assessed at the beginning. Now, you may remember that we had a Mishnah about, 4 or 5 months ago that talked about complications and paying medical expenses for complications. And it seemed to be assuming that we were in real time as the medical situation developed, assessing whether these complications were caused by the original injury. And if they were, then we would go back for more money to the assailant. And that seems to be not quite the same thing as what this Breita says. Nobody commented on it in an obvious way on the page. So at least not that I saw, maybe I didn't look carefully enough. But my guess would be that the way that you explain these 2 things, and they're not exact agreement with each other, is that the medical expenses for the original injury are decided at the time of the original lawsuit, and they don't change even if they turn out to be wrong. But if a new medical situation develops, which wasn't there at the time of the original assessment, then if we think it was caused by the original medical situation, then you can be charged more. But it would have to be a new medical phenomenon that had not been there at the beginning. Okay. In any case, so if it turns out that it takes longer than anticipated for the healing to take place, which may or may not mean that the medical expenses are greater, I don't know, not necessarily. It could be that you take longer to recover, but the doctor doesn't come extra times. But it's definitely going to increase the amount of time that you're out of work. Nonetheless, we stick with the original assessment. Which may mean, by the way, that what you really need to pay is not so much what you cost this person, but what you could have anticipated at the time that you did the assault would be the cost to a normal person, or to what this person appeared to be. And if it turns out that they look stronger than they are, then that may not be your problem. That might be what's going on here. On the other hand, Amduhu v'hivri, if they assessed him and then he got healthier, in other words, he recovered faster than they anticipated he would, he still gets to keep all of the money. Even though he or she, doesn't matter, even though the victim was able to return to work sooner than anticipated and didn't actually lose as much money, and possibly use less medical care, didn't actually need to pay for as much medication, didn't need to pay as many doctor bills. Nonetheless, they get to keep the money. And the Gemara will express an opinion about why that is in a minute. Shmamina yesh omed l'nezikin. So the Gemara says, well, from this I can conclude that we definitely do assess with reference to damages. It says it so right there in the Breita. It says they assess him. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, you're answering the wrong question. L'meimad gavra kama liktsar meha maka kama lo miktsar. So if you want to know for this particular person, I'm assessing him how long he's going to not be able to work, or how long until he will be able to work. Lo kami bayalan devadayam dinan. No one was asking whether we would do that assessment. Obviously, you have to do that assessment. You can't charge people amounts of money without deciding how much those amounts of money are. Everybody always knew we were going to have to do an assessment for the 5 payments to know how much they were going to be. That's not what we were asking. The thing that we were asking about, that was the question of whether we assess an object. Can this object cause this particular kind of injury? So we're asking the question not about the victim. How much damage did they suffer? How badly hurt are they? How much money did they lose? What should you have to pay them? Not those questions. Those questions, obviously, we're going to have to assess. No one ever questioned that. The question is, you hit the person with a stick. Was it a big enough stick to cause this damage? Was it a hard enough stick to cause this damage? Should the person who hit him with the stick have expected that the stick would just fall apart and the person wouldn't get hurt? Like, do we need to look at the stick and assess that? So, one more try. Tashma. Shimon HaTimni Omer. So now we're back to the Breita that we quoted in last week's class. Shimon HaTimni says, Ma egrof miuchad shemasur la'idav la'idim. Just as a fist is special, I think we said particular last week, it doesn't matter, because it is given to is submitted to the court and the judges so that they can look at it. And presumably the accused is present in the courtroom, so all of his body parts are available for the court and the witnesses to look at and say, well, he does have kind of big hands, or whatever, like that's going to be available during the court. So af kol miuchad shemasur la'idav la'idim. Likewise, anything which is identified by this characteristic, that it is submitted to the court and the judges, meaning it can be brought, or it is brought into the court so that the judges and the witnesses can look at it and see whether it seems plausible that it caused this damage. Meaning we have come back around to our original source and said, yeah, shmamina yesh omed l'nezikin shmamina. So we conclude, excuse me, we conclude that there is, in fact, assessment of the weapon for damages. Even though it's worth noting that the case that Shimon HaTimni was talking about was a case in which it was questionable whether the person was going to die or not. And so we didn't actually know whether this was a case of assault or a case of murder. So using Shimon HaTimni to answer the question, do we do an assessment only in a case of murder or also in a case of assault, is a little dodgy, because the truth is that his case is a borderline case between those two things. No, we seem to have decided to use it as a proof anyway. Okay, so now we're going back to the second to last Breita we quoted. Amar. So you said that amduhu v'hivri notnin lo kol ma she'amduhu. If they assessed him and then he recovered faster than anticipated, nonetheless we still give him all of the money that he was assessed for. Messiah Leila Rava. This helps Rava because Rava said the following. So if we have somebody who was assessed that they were going to miss all of today from work. And so we made the person who injured them pay for the whole day of unemployment. And then the and then he got better quickly, and by noon he was healed, and he was doing his work in the afternoon. So you could reasonably say, and if you were the assailant, you might very well say, hey, wait a minute, you obviously made a mistake. He didn't actually lose as much money as you said I needed to pay him, so I should get that money back, because if he didn't suffer a loss, why should I have to pay him? That seems like a reasonable complaint. But nonetheless, Rava says, we give him the money for the whole day, min shmayahu derachmi alei, because heaven had mercy on him. The idea seems to be that we work on the assumption that if at the beginning of the day he looked like he wasn't going to be able to go to work today, he looked sick enough that he was going to have to stay in bed all day to recover from this injury, or for that matter, if at the beginning of the month he looked like he was going to lose the whole month, like I don't think it matters the length of the scale, but whenever it is that we assess the person, it appeared that he was going to miss a certain amount of time from work, then that we assumed that we were right about that. That was the correct answer. It just happens that sometimes people get, special mercy from heaven, and God will, make a miracle so that you can get better faster. But it doesn't mean that the assailant didn't cause an assault bad enough to make you miss a whole day of work. The assailant caused an assault bad enough to cause you to miss a whole day of work. And then God gave you a present. Right? So we're seeing whatever happens in your actual real life healing process as being sort of between you and God. And we're seeing your loss of money for paying for unemployment and medical expenses. We're seeing that as being a sort of objective thing that you could measure at the beginning. And if it turns out not to accurately reflect the amount of money it actually caused you, that's not because we measured it wrong. That's because we measured it correctly, and something else went right or wrong that is not connected to the assault. It's just because God gave you a present, or God punished you, or whatever. This is theologically no more desirable or undesirable than any other case in which you say that a specific good or bad thing that happens to somebody must be because God is happy or unhappy with them. It has all the usual pros and cons of that. But from a legal perspective, it does give you the advantage of being able to say, we're going to make a decision in court today. That's going to be the final decision. And unless something, dramatically changes, a new medical condition develops or whatever, that's going to be it, right? We're not going to keep chasing you down for wait, it's another $10. And the decision is going to be final. It's going to be over. The case is finished, and we can all go home and move on with our lives. And that, I think, is a significant advantage. I don't know that that's necessarily why they're doing it. I think the theology may be real, but it is a benefit. Okay, that is the end of what I have for you this evening. Are there questions?
So when it said that we don't really assess the person, we assess the object.
No, we definitely do assess the person, but we weren't asking about that. We were asking about whether we assess the object.
Right. So in the case of the boar, it seemed to me like that was a Breita, right? That the Breita was giving a blanket assessment of the bore itself.
So we weren't sure there. We weren't sure whether when it said that less than 10 tefachim would cause damages but wouldn't cause death, we didn't know whether that meant that anything under 10 tefachim causes damages, and we're not picky about what damage it is and how deep the pit is, or whether less than 10 tefachim meant like a little bit less than 10 tefachim, but not like, almost nothing. And I think that now that we've come to the conclusion at the end that we do in fact have assessment for damages, I think it's going to mean in general across the board, that before you say, this is your fault, this damage is your fault, we're going to check whether it's, a fluke or whether it's reasonable that it should have caused that.
By checking the bore itself.
Presumably, it means that we need to check the bore itself. Now, we had a machloket last week whether such things needed to be checked by the judges or whether they only needed to be checked by the witnesses. And it's entirely possible that we're going to rule that it's the witnesses, not the judges, especially because the witnesses are there at the time of the assault. The judges might not hear about it until 2 weeks later when things might have changed. So we might hold by not by Shimon HaTimni, but I think it was Rabbi Akiva was the other position, and say that we trust the judges. But yeah, the judges are going to say, yeah, it was about this deep, and I don't know if they have to measure it or if they can hold their hand up and say it was about like this. But we're going to do our best to determine that it's not a fluke.
So that would be in addition to assessing the victim or the object of the damage to make sure that
right. So we're going to look at the donkey, and we're going to say, yeah, the donkey has a sprained ankle and it's not going to be able to pull a wagon for 2 weeks, or I don't know, whatever. I've never had a donkey. I'm making things up here, but whatever. And then the witnesses are going to say, well, it looked like the pit was about this deep, and we're going to turn to the veterinarian and say, well, does this sprained ankle make sense with that depth of pit? And yeah, I think that's what's going to happen here.
Okay.
And similarly with, an object that got broken by being hit by something, or a person who got injured by somebody pushing them, or, whatever. Like, I think we're deciding across the board that yes, we are picky, and we are going to check that it really makes sense that these things fit together.
Even in the case of not touching someone, but causing blindness.
That seems to be a technicality. Nobody questions that the guy is deaf because you blew a shofar in his ear. I don't think nobody's suggesting that the reason you're not responsible is because you didn't cause the damage. But there seems to be a technicality that if you didn't cause a physical impact on the person's body, then you can't be held responsible for physical damage to their body. And I don't love that technicality, but it seems to be the way it is.
Okay.
But the truth is, I don't think the Gemara loves it either. The Gemara says God will get you, which is the kind of language you use when you don't love the results you've ended up with.
Okay. That's when it says the court of man and not, or the court of God, but not the court of man. Yeah.
Yeah. And there wasn't language like that here, but in other places, in other places, in particular in Bava Metzia, I have seen the Gemara say that because you did something which the court of God would be unhappy with, so then we assess how much money the court of God would have charged you and tell you that if you were a decent person, you would pay it. Right? It's like it's not quite the same thing as like actually going to your house and like taking your jewelry out of your jewelry box and using it to pay your debts with, which we would totally do if it were a physical assault. But it's not quite the same thing as saying, sorry, there's nothing we can do to help you either. It's somewhere in between.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sure. Any other questions? Okay, I think we are meeting as usual next Monday evening. I am going to be away over the weekend, but I'm already mostly prepared, so I think it's going to be okay anyway. If that turns out not to be true, I'll let you know. But I think we're meeting a week from tonight, and I don't want to cancel any more classes because I do want to finish the chapter this year.
Okay, good.
All right. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Good night.